Welcome to Threads of Truth, the podcast where real-life mysteries meet internet speculation. Today we're revisiting one of America's most heartbreaking unidentified child cases. A little boy found inside a discarded suitcase whose identity remained unknown for more than 65 years.
It really is one of those cases that just, it fundamentally shifts how you look at the world.
It does. And, we're examining a timeline today that stretches all the way back to an era long before digital footprints, before cell phone towers or, neighborhood security cameras on every porch.
Right, a totally different world.
Exactly. And when you look at the sheer amount of physical trauma this child endured, a really profound, grounding question immediately surfaces for you as a listener, which is, how does a little boy simply vanish from society without a single missing person report ever being filed?
It's the ultimate question, isn't it? Because it forces us to look at the communities we live in and the things we choose to ignore. I mean, the most terrifying mysteries we encounter, they rarely involve these brilliant, masterminded cover-ups orchestrated by criminal geniuses.
Yeah, that's mostly just in the movies.
Exactly. The reality is far more mundane and honestly much more chilling because they are almost always about the systemic silence of a community. People just looking the other way.
Mm-hmm.
It requires a massive failure of our social safety nets to allow a vulnerable person to just fall through the cracks without making a single sound.
That systemic silence is exactly what we're going to walk through today. Our mission for this exploration is to take you step by step through the tragic discovery of the boy, the groundbreaking forensic science that finally gave him his name, and then the really dark, chaotic internet fallout that erupted when the truth was partially revealed.
Which is a whole other layer of tragedy, really.
It is. So to understand how those cracks form, we need to completely immerse ourselves in the environment where this began. We'll go back to a cold, rainy February in 1957.
Setting the scene here is crucial.
Right. So picture the Fox Chase neighborhood of Philadelphia. Now today, it's heavily developed, right? But back in the late 1950s, this specific area near Susquehanna Road was this brush-filled rural thicket on the absolute outskirts of the city.
Very isolated.
Extremely isolated. It's the kind of overgrown, forgotten terrain where people went specifically when they didn't want to be seen by anyone else.
And the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the boy, they perfectly encapsulate that theme of hidden vices and isolation. Because the child was actually found twice.
Wait, twice?
Yes, by two completely different people on separate occasions before the police were ever even notified.
That detail is just staggering when you really think about the psychology of it.
Yeah.
Two separate people stumble across a deceased child, and their first instinct isn't to run for help.
No, it wasn't. The first person was this young man who was out in those woods checking muskrat traps. And, he had set these traps illegally.
Okay, so he's already doing something wrong.
Yeah. Exactly. So when he stumbled upon the clearing and saw the boy's body, he basically did the calculus in his head. He weighed the life of an unidentified child against the possibility that the police might confiscate his traps. Or, hand him a fine.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. Self-preservation won. He walked away and chose to remain completely silent.
He just left him there.
He did. Just left him. So a few days pass. Now we are at February 25th. A 26-year-old college student named Frederick Benonis is driving through that exact same area.
Oh.
He later claimed to police that he saw a rabbit dart into the underbrush, and knowing there were traps hidden in the thicket, he decided to pull over and check. He walks into the woods and spots this large cardboard box.
Right, and Benonis looks inside, but he also walks away without calling the police.
Mm-hmm.
He tells himself it's just a discarded doll. It wasn't until the following day when he heard a radio broadcast about a missing 4-year-old girl in a neighboring state that he finally picked up the phone. But the story he told the police about chasing a rabbit that wasn't entirely true, was it?
Far from it. The darker truth emerged a bit later. Benonis wasn't in those woods to look at wildlife. He was parking in that secluded area to spy on the young women at the nearby Good Shepherd School.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In the 1950s, institutions like Good Shepherd were often designated for wayward girls, which was a polite, euphemistic term used at the time for troubled teens or unwed, pregnant young women who had been, hidden away by their families due to social stigma.
So he was there to peep on them.
Precisely. Benonis was there to be a voyeur. He delayed calling the authorities because he was absolutely terrified of incriminating himself and exposing his own highly questionable behavior.
Notice how this little boy was completely surrounded by the secrets of others, even in death. I mean, you have a poacher prioritizing his illegal traps
Hmm.
and a voyeur prioritizing his reputation.
It's deeply sad.
Their own hidden lives took precedence over a child's body.
It sets a deeply unsettling tone for the entire investigation, doesn't it? Anonymity and tragedy intersecting with the hidden flaws of everyday people.
It really does. And when the Philadelphia police finally arrived at Susquehanna Road and documented the scene, the physical evidence they uncovered was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, the condition of the body was horrific.
The victim was a little boy, estimated by the medical examiner to be between 4 and 6 years old, but he weighed only 30 to 40 pounds.
Which is severely emaciated for that age group.
Right. And he was covered in bruises at varying stages of healing, indicating severe, prolonged physical abuse over a long period. The ultimate cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head.
And the forensic clues found during the autopsy, they were highly unusual and completely baffled the medical examiners of the era.
What specifically stood out to them?
Well, one of the most glaring details was the boy's hair. It had been crudely chopped off, buzzed very close to the scalp in an incredibly haphazard, rushed manner.
Like someone was in a panic.
Exactly. But what made this particularly disturbing was that clumps of the cut hair were still clinging to the boy's body and face.
Which tells us a lot about the timeline of the murder, right?
Exactly. Because when hair is cut while someone is standing or sitting up, it falls away to the floor. The fact that it was stuck to his skin suggested the haircut happened either immediately before he was killed or shortly after his death while he was laying down.
Just awful.
In forensic pathology, a sudden, crude haircut like that is almost universally interpreted as a frantic attempt to conceal the victim's identity. I mean, if a child is known in the neighborhood for having long, curly blonde hair, shaving their head makes them significantly harder to recognize in a composite sketch.
Or a photograph.
Exactly.
The medical examiner also noted the condition of the child's skin, particularly on his extremities, right?
Yes, his hands and the soles of his feet were heavily wrinkled. The specific medical term is maceration.
The maceration.
It happens when skin absorbs water, causing it to swell and wrinkle, like when you stay in the bath too long. Because this was present on his hands and feet, it indicated they had been submerged in water for a significant period shortly before he died.
Then we get to the medical history, which is where the mystery just deepens significantly. Because the boy had distinct surgical scars.
Very distinct.
He had a very precise L-shaped scar under his chin, about a 1/4 inch long on each side. But more importantly, he had what appeared to be surgical cut-down incisions on his left ankle and his groin.
Yeah, and to understand the importance of that, we have to look at pediatric medicine in the 1950s.
Right, because it wasn't like it is today.
Not at all. A cut-down incision is a medical procedure performed to expose a vein. Today, we have these ultra-thin needles and advanced ultrasound techniques to start an IV on a tiny pediatric patient. But decades ago, if a small child was severely dehydrated or required an emergency blood transfusion, finding a viable vein was incredibly difficult.
So what would they do?
A doctor would literally take a scalpel, make an incision in the ankle or groin, physically locate the vein by digging into the tissue, and insert the line directly.
Wow. That requires professional medical intervention. It means this child wasn't just locked in a basement for his entire short life.
Exactly. He had seen a doctor, he had been in a hospital or a clinic at some point. Someone, somewhere in the medical system, had treated this boy for a severe condition, yet no one stepped forward to claim him.
The juxtaposition of his medical care and the way he was discarded is horrifying. When police found him, he was naked, wrapped tightly in a faded, inexpensive plaid blanket made of cotton flannel.
Just tossed away.
And he had been stuffed inside a large cardboard box. Specifically, it was a box that originally contained a J.C. Penney white bassinet. Printed on the side were the words, "Fragile, do not open with a knife."
A container meant for a bassinet, the ultimate symbol of new life, safety, and parental care, repurposed as a makeshift coffin in the freezing rain.
It's so dark. The sources also mentioned a plaid suitcase was found nearby in the thicket, which investigators believed was likely used to transport the boy or the materials to the disposal site before being tossed aside.
Which is where the nickname the boy in the box or the child in the suitcase comes from in the early press.
Right. And the Philadelphia police were absolutely desperate to solve this. The lengths they went to were unprecedented for the time.
Oh, we are talking about a mobilization of resources that rivaled major federal investigations. The police department printed 400,000 flyers bearing the boy's likeness.
400,000.
And they didn't just staple them to telephone poles in Fox Chase. They systematically included a flyer in the local gas bills for the entire city of Philadelphia.
That is brilliant, actually.
It was. They ensured that almost every single household in the metropolitan area would be forced to look at this child's face when they opened their mail.
They also brought in 270 police academy recruits. They formed massive lines, standing shoulder to shoulder, and physically combed through the woods around Susquehanna Road looking for any stray fiber, any button, any footprint.
Just an incredible amount of manpower.
They dispatched detectives to check the intake records of every hospital, every orphanage, and every foster home in the tri-state region. They cross-referenced the boy's footprints and fingerprints with national databases, hoping maybe he had been fingerprinted for a hospital birth record.
But, the reality of forensic science in 1957 was severely limited.
Right, no DNA.
Exactly. They had no DNA databases. They didn't have computerized missing persons networks where a detective in Pennsylvania could instantly flag a case for a detective in California. They had to rely almost entirely on visual recognition. Someone had to look at a picture and say, I know that face.
Which led the authorities to employ methods that, by today's standards, feel incredibly macabre.
Yeah, this part is hard to stomach.
Because the postmortem photographs of the battered child were too gruesome for public distribution, they attempted to make him look alive. The medical examiner's office actually dressed the deceased boy in a bright yellow flannel shirt and a cap. They sat his body upright in a chair, opened his eyes, and posed him for photographs. These were the images they distributed to the public and the press.
It is a deeply unsettling concept, but you have to view it through the lens of their sheer desperation. They operated on the theory that a neighbor or a distant relative might not recognize a traumatized deceased child, but they might recognize the boy if he looked like he was just sitting for a school portrait.
They were trying to spark a memory using the only crude tools they had available.
Exactly. And they pursued every single physical lead with that same level of frantic intensity. Take the bassinet box, for example. It wasn't just a generic box. It had a specific serial number stamped on it.
Right, which seems like a huge break.
Investigators traced that exact serial number through the JCPenney supply chain. They tracked it to a specific retail location in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. And the store records indicated that only 12 of those specific white bassinets had been sold between December 1956 and February 1957.
It must have felt like the case was cracking wide open right then.
Oh, absolutely. Detectives managed to track down 8 of the families who purchased those bassinets. They interviewed them, checked their homes, and verified the whereabouts of their children. Every single one of those leads was cleared. The trail went completely cold.
It's so frustrating. And the recruit searching the woods also found a royal blue corduroy cap at the crime scene. It was a distinctive cap featuring a leather strap and a metal buckle. Detectives checked the manufacturer's stamp inside the lining and traced it to a specific storefront. The Robbins Bald Eagle Cap Shop, located in South Philadelphia.
And they interviewed the shop owner, a woman named Hannah Robbins. Amazingly, she remembered the exact cap.
Really? Out of all the hats she sold?
Yes, because the buyer had asked her to customize it by adding a longer leather strap. She described the purchaser as a blonde man in his late 20s wearing work clothes. The police dedicated massive resources to finding this blonde man. They staked out the area, interviewed local laborers, and circulated descriptions. He was never identified.
So thousands of hours of legwork, hundreds of thousands of flyers, and it all resulted in 65 years of absolute silence. The boy was eventually buried in a potter's field. Years later, his remains were moved to Ivy Hill Cemetery, and a headstone was erected that simply read, America's Unknown Child.
A heartbreaking end to the physical investigation.
That is where the investigation remained frozen for decades. So to understand how we finally got a name, we have to shift the timeline forward to the modern era, specifically to the breakthroughs culminating in 2022. We move out of the era of visual recognition and step into the microscopic sequencing of human identity.
The forensic science that ultimately broke this case is genuinely a modern marvel, but the biological journey to extract that DNA was an agonizing, decades-long process. The authorities actually exhumed the boy's remains twice before they succeeded.
Twice?
Yes. The first exhumation was in 1998. The goal was to extract mitochondrial DNA from the enamel of the boy's tooth.
Now, mitochondrial DNA is passed down maternally, right, from mother to child. And tooth enamel is incredibly dense, which makes it a great protective capsule for genetic material.
Precisely. They successfully extracted the mitochondrial DNA in 1998. The problem was the technology of the era. The databases back then were incredibly small, primarily consisting of convicted offenders. Unsurprisingly, the boy's maternal line didn't match anyone in the system.
So the case stalled again.
Stalled again. Fast forward to 2019. The technology surrounding genetic genealogy had advanced exponentially. Investigators exhumed the remains a second time to extract a new, more comprehensive sample. But by this point, the physical condition of the bones was catastrophic.
Yeah, Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, one of the leading forensic genealogists who worked on the case, described the state of this DNA as being like confetti.
Confetti.
Because after 60-plus years in the ground, enduring moisture, temperature fluctuations, and bacterial degradation, the DNA strands were shattered into millions of tiny, disconnected fragments. Standard police labs looked at it and essentially said it was impossible to read.
The biological samples embarked on this massive international journey just to find a laboratory with the capability to sequence them. They were first sent to the International Commission on Missing Persons in The Hague, an organization that specializes in identifying victims of war crimes and mass disasters.
Serious experts.
Very serious. From there, the extracts traveled to Hudson Alpha Discovery Life Sciences in Alabama, both incredibly sophisticated facilities, but the degradation of the sample was too severe. The sequencing failed.
Finally, at the recommendation of global experts, the specimens were sent to the Department of Evolutionary Genetics at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany. Now, the Max Planck Institute is famous for something very specific.
Yes, they are.
They are the scientists who study Neanderthal DNA.
That is exactly why they were the last hope. The scientists at Max Planck specialize in ancient DNA protocols. When you are trying to extract genetic material from a bone that is 40,000 years old, you are dealing with extreme degradation and massive environmental contamination. I mean, bacteria from the soil essentially eat the bone and leave their own DNA behind.
Right, creating a ton of biological noise.
Exactly. The Institute has developed highly specialized chemical baths and computational algorithms designed to isolate and amplify incredibly short, damaged fragments of human DNA while filtering out that environmental noise. They applied these exact protocols designed for studying human evolution to the remains of a child from 1957.
And it worked. They were able to generate a workable forensic genetic genealogy profile. Once the Max Planck Institute mapped the genetic code, the genealogists took over. They uploaded that data file into open-source commercial databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, mapping out distant cousins and working their way through the family tree.
A painstaking process.
Truly. And this agonizing scientific journey culminated on December 8, 2022. The Philadelphia Police Department stood before the cameras and finally gave America's unknown child his name.
A huge moment.
He was Joseph Augustus Sorelli, born January 13, 1953.
It was a watershed moment. It proved to the entire forensic community that even the most degraded, complex, cold cases could be solved if you pair absolute persistence with cutting-edge technology.
But the story doesn't end with a neat, triumphant bow. While the DNA gave Joseph his name back, the specific way that information was released to the public inadvertently sparked a modern nightmare for his living relatives. We are moving from the sterile, objective triumph of a German laboratory straight into the chaotic, highly emotional realm of internet true crime culture.
And this transition is so important to understand. For 65 years, the case of the unknown boy was essentially a blank canvas for the public imagination. Human beings are deeply uncomfortable with unresolved traumas, you know?
We want answers. We need a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Exactly. A mystery of this magnitude demands a narrative. And over the decades, people were more than willing to project their own theories onto that canvas.
The early pre-DNA theories that dominated the public consciousness showed just how desperate investigators and the public were to make sense of the senseless. Some of these theories became so deeply entrenched that people treated them as established fact.
Oh, absolutely. One of the most prominent was the Nicoletti family theory. This was championed by a man named Remington Bristow, who worked as an investigator for the medical examiner's office. Bristow became profoundly obsessed with this case. His dedication crossed over into a dark fixation.
How far did he go?
He literally carried a plastered death mask of the boy's face in his briefcase wherever he went.
Think about the psychological toll of carrying a murdered child's face with you every single day. He was utterly consumed by it.
He was. Bristow eventually consulted a psychic who directed him to investigate a local foster home located just a mile and a half from the Susquehanna Road dump site. The home was run by a man named Arthur Nicoletti.
Okay.
Bristow developed this elaborate theory that the boy was the illegitimate child of Nicoletti's stepdaughter. He believed the boy's death was a tragic accident, perhaps a fall that the family frantically covered up to avoid a scandal. Years later, Bristow even attended an estate sale at that very house and found a bassinet that matched the J.C. Penney brand.
Which sounds like a massive smoking gun. A bassinet of the exact same brand at a foster home a mile away.
It fueled Bristow's absolute conviction until the day he died. But despite his obsession, the police could never find a single shred of physical evidence linking the boy to the Nicoletti home. And decades later, modern DNA testing proved definitively that the boy had absolutely no genetic relation to the Nicoletti family.
So that entire theory was a ghost hunt.
Basically, yes.
Then we have the infamous M witness, which surfaced much later in 2002. A woman from Ohio, known in police files only as Martha, or M, contacted investigators with a deeply disturbing narrative.
Very disturbing.
She claimed that back in 1954, her mother, who she described as severely abusive, had purchased the boy from his birth parents. Martha claimed the boy was subjected to years of horrific physical and sexual abuse in their home. She stated that in February 1957, her mother flew into a murderous rage, slammed the boy to the bathroom floor, and killed him.
What made Martha's account so compelling to seasoned investigators wasn't just the overall narrative. It was a highly specific, granular detail she provided about the precipitating event. She claimed her mother's final lethal rage was triggered because the boy had thrown up his dinner in the bathtub.
And what was the dinner?
The dinner, according to Martha, was baked beans.
And here's where it gets chilling for you listening. Because the original autopsy report, which had not been fully released to the public in all its minutiae, specifically to weed out false confessions, documented a dark brown residue in the boy's esophagus and stomach. The medical examiner at the time noted it was consistent with the remains of baked beans.
It is the kind of corroborating detail that makes a detective's blood run cold. Furthermore, Martha's story about the murder happening in a bathtub perfectly explained the severe maceration the water wrinkling found on the boy's hands and feet.
It sounds like an open and shut case. But the police spent 6 months investigating Martha's claims and ultimately walked away. Why?
Because despite the eerie coincidences, they could not find a single piece of independent corroboration. They reviewed property records and interviewed neighbors who had lived next to Martha's childhood home in 1957. Not a single person remembered a little blonde boy living there.
No one saw him.
No one. There were no medical records, no school records, no photographs. Additionally, investigators learned that Martha had a documented history of severe mental health struggles, which cast doubt on the reliability of her memories. Eventually, her identity was leaked to the local media, and she fled the country to avoid the intense scrutiny.
Which brings us back to the environment of 2022. You have a public that has spent decades digesting these elaborate theories about foster homes and abusive adoptive mothers. Then the police hold a press conference.
Right.
They announce they have solved the identity of the boy. His name is Joseph Augustus Sorelli. But citing a desire to protect the privacy of his living relatives, the police explicitly refused to release the names of his biological parents.
The authorities were operating under a noble intention. They recognized that the biological parents were dead, but Joseph had living half-siblings who had just learned of this horrific family secret. The police wanted to shield them from the media circus. But that decision demonstrates a profound misunderstanding of how the internet functions today.
It was the digital equivalent of tossing a single puzzle piece to a room full of people obsessed with completing the picture. By giving out the last name Sorelli and mentioning during the press conference that the family had ties to a specific area of West Philadelphia, They gave the internet everything it needed.
To understand the fallout, you have to look at the cultural shift in how true crime is consumed. 30 years ago, true crime was a passive experience. You read a paperback book by Anne Rule, or you watched an episode of Unsolved Mysteries on television.
You just took in the story.
Exactly. Today, it is an interactive, gamified experience. Platforms like Reddit, Web Sleuth, and Facebook host communities of thousands of people who view these real-life tragedies as puzzles waiting to be solved.
The genealogists who worked on the case described the immediate aftermath of the press conference as absolute true crime nutballery. The internet sleuths went to work instantly. They didn't need police databases. They utilized the exact same public tools the genealogists used.
Yep, the open source stuff.
They pulled up public census records, marriage certificates, obituaries, and commercial ancestry profiles. Within hours, literally hours, amateur detectives on Reddit had identified the man they believed to be Joseph's biological father.
And this is where the gamification of true crime crosses the line into real-world harm. Identifying a historical figure from the 1950s is one thing, but these online communities didn't stop there. They used those public records to map out the modern living descendants of that man.
This is where it gets so out of hand.
They tracked down the personal Facebook profiles and Instagram accounts of Joseph's half-siblings. Keep in mind, these are people who are alive today. People who were either infants or not even born when Joseph was murdered.
And the police had quietly notified the Zarelli family shortly before the public press conference. Naturally, many of those family members reacted by locking their social media accounts, changing their privacy settings to hide from the incoming media storm. How did the internet sleuths interpret that very normal desire for privacy?
They viewed a locked Facebook profile as a definitive admission of guilt.
It requires a terrifying leap of logic, fueled entirely by the echo chamber of the internet. You have a family who just received the shock of a lifetime discovering they had a half-brother who was brutally murdered before they were even born. Instead of empathy, they were met with an avalanche of harassment.
It was awful. Thousands of strangers began messaging them, accusing them of being complicit in a multi-generational cover-up. Commenters were spinning wild, baseless theories suggesting their parents were involved in human trafficking rings or underground baby-selling operations.
The harassment breached the boundaries of social media and bled into memorial sites. Sleuths went onto the website Find a Grave, a platform designed for genealogical research and paying respects to the dead. They actively began editing the memorial pages of recently deceased Zarelli family members, uploading photos of the battered child and writing biographies that linked these innocent people to a horrific 1957 murder.
They were vandalizing the digital graves of a family just to make reality fit the sensational narrative they had built in their heads.
It is a grotesque manifestation of what happens when real human tragedy is treated purely as entertainment. The intense pressure and online stalking continued until January 2023, when investigative journalists finally uncovered and published the names of Joseph's biological parents, Augustus Gazzarelli and Mary Elizabeth Betsy Abel.
Once the names were out, the actual verified reality of the situation emerged, and it was far less sensational than the internet wanted it to be. The Zarelli family attorney released a statement clarifying the timeline. Betsy Abel was 21 years old when she gave birth. Gus Zarelli was a few years older. They were not married. They did not have a formal, recognized relationship. It is highly probable, given the social stigma of the 1950s, that Betsy gave Joseph up for adoption or placed him in an informal foster care arrangement long before any of the abuse began.
And what about Gus?
The attorney was adamant that there was no credible allegation or evidence that Gus Zarelli ever even knew the child existed, let alone had any hand in harming him. Both Gus and Betsy had passed away years prior to the DNA breakthrough.
The fallout from this case presents us with a deeply complex situation. By utilizing forensic genetic genealogy, society achieved an incredible triumph. We solved a 65-year-old mystery, restored dignity to a forgotten child, and advanced the capabilities of forensic science. But the mechanism of that victory opened a Pandora's box.
It really did.
It unleashed vigilante justice, mass doxing, and baseless harassment against an innocent family who were entirely unaware of the tragedy.
It demands that we look closely at the tools we are using. We got the name, but the piece of living people was shattered to acquire it. That brings us to a much deeper analysis of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or FIGG. because this technology isn't just solving old mysteries, it is fundamentally altering the landscape of privacy and criminal justice.
To understand the implications, we really need to break down the actual mechanics of FIGG. How does it differ from the DNA testing we see on police procedurals?
Traditional police DNA testing relies on a method called autosomal short tandem repeat testing, or STR.
STR is the standard, right? The kind of testing used in the National CODIS database.
Exactly. Think of your DNA as a massive, multi-volume encyclopedia. STR testing doesn't read the whole book. It looks at a few specific predetermined paragraphs, and it counts how many times a single word is repeated in those paragraphs. Because the number of repeats varies wildly from person to person, it creates a unique genetic fingerprint.
Which is great if you have a suspect.
Yes. It is incredibly fast and highly accurate for identifying a specific individual. If you find blood at a crime scene, generate an STR profile, and run it through the CODIS database, you will find a match, but only if the suspect has been previously arrested and had their DNA entered into the system.
If the suspect, or in this case, the unidentified victim, isn't in the police database, an STR profile is useless. It's a dead end. It can't tell you who their cousins are or where their ancestors came from.
That is the limitation of STR. But forensic investigative genetic genealogy relies on a completely different scientific method, single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. Instead of counting repeated words in a single paragraph, SNP testing looks at hundreds of thousands of individual specific letters scattered across the entire encyclopedia of your genome.
This is the exact same technology that commercial ancestry companies like 23andMe use to tell you that you're 20% Irish or 40% West African.
Yes. Because SNPs analyze the broader genetic landscape, they can identify shared segments of DNA between people who are extremely distantly related third, fourth, or even fifth cousins. When investigators extract a SNP profile from a cold case, they do not put it into the closed police database. They upload a digital file of that genome into open data, publicly accessible ancestry databases like GEDmatch.
Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the genealogist, provided a brilliant way to visualize this process in our source material. She compared it to solving a massive, complex Sudoku puzzle. Remember, the DNA extracted from Joseph was degraded like confetti. But with SNP testing, you don't need the complete, pristine picture to start.
Right, you just need fragments.
You take those scattered genetic fragments and upload them. The database flags distant cousins. The genealogist then begins networking those fragments together. They build out family trees, tracking marriage records and census data. They fill in the intersecting vertical lines, the horizontal lines, the diagonals. They build the entire surrounding family structure until the only empty space left in the center of that massive puzzle is the exact specific person you are looking for.
It is a mathematically elegant, stunningly powerful process. However, when we step back and examine the broader landscape of how FEG is being utilized by law enforcement, we have to acknowledge a very uncomfortable reality.
Which is?
This field operates largely as a highly unregulated Wild West. The rules are being written in real time.
Which leads us to one of the most sobering and provocative pieces of source material in our stack today. A comprehensive legal article published in The Harbinger regarding the use of FIG in baby doe investigations. This is where the conversation takes a very dark, complex turn. The public universally cheers when this technology is used to finally catch a notorious serial killer, or when it restores the identity of a murdered child like Joseph. But what happens when this unregulated, powerful tool is turned against marginalized individuals in highly ambiguous circumstances?
The Harbinger article meticulously details a deeply concerning trend in modern forensics. Since 2018, there have been over 60 baby doe FIG investigations launched across the United States. These specific cases involve extracting DNA from the unidentified remains of a perinaate, a medical term for a fetus or a newborn infant that were discovered years, sometimes decades ago.
Yeah.
Law enforcement uses the genetic Sudoku puzzle to track down the parents. And once the family tree is built, the vast majority of those targeted for prosecution are the biological mothers.
This is where the context is absolutely vital. In nearly half of these cold cases, the mothers maintain a completely different narrative than the police. They state that decades ago, often as terrified, isolated teenagers, they went into labor alone, entirely outside a medical setting. They tragically delivered a stillborn fetus. In a state of severe postpartum trauma, panic, and fear of social stigma, they buried the remains privately, and carried that agonizing secret for 30 years.
It's a very different story than murder.
Very different. And now, decades later, detectives are showing up at their front doors with a genealogical printout proving maternity and accusing them of cold-blooded homicide.
The terrifying aspect of this trend isn't just the genealogy, it is the underlying pathology being used to secure these convictions. To charge a woman with murder in these specific cases, the state carries the burden of proving that the child was actually born alive.
Which is hard to do decades later.
Almost impossible. How does a medical examiner definitively prove a live birth for a body that was found in the woods and autopsied in 1985? They frequently rely on an incredibly controversial, outdated forensic technique known as the lung float test, or dosimesia.
The history of this test is astonishing. I had to read the Harbinger section multiple times because it sounds like fiction. The lung float test didn't originate in a modern laboratory. It actually traces its roots back to the era of the witch trials.
The premise of dosimesia is deceptively simple. A forensic pathologist removes the lungs of the deceased infant and places them in a container of liquid, usually water. If the lungs float to the surface, the theory asserts that the baby took at least one breath of air, inflating the tissue, meaning it was born alive. Therefore, the death is ruled a homicide. If the lungs sink to the bottom, the baby never took a breath, meaning it was stillborn.
It sounds identical to the medieval pseudoscience used to execute women centuries ago. If she floats, she's a witch.
The scientific community's current consensus is that it is essentially exactly that. Modern, board-certified forensic pathologists and major advocacy groups like Physicians for Human Rights have repeatedly published papers stating that the lung float test is wholly unreliable and scientifically invalid.
Because there are other reasons lungs might float.
Exactly. There are numerous biological reasons a lung might float or sink that have nothing to do with taking a breath. The lungs of a stillborn infant will frequently float because the natural process of decomposition creates gases trapped in the tissue. Conversely, the lungs of an infant born alive can sink if they inhaled amniotic fluid or suffered from an infection.
But because these original autopsies were conducted 20, 30, or 40 years ago, the physical evidence, the tissue itself, is long gone. It was destroyed or degraded decades ago. A modern defense attorney cannot hire an independent expert to retest the lungs. So, you have women today who are facing decades in prison based on a witch trial-era float test documented on a typewriter in 1985, paired with an unquestionable DNA match from an ancestry database.
The Harbinger article draws a direct line between these prosecutions and the exact same cultural obsession we saw surrounding the Zarelli case. When a small town finds a baby doe in a ditch in 1985, the lore of that dead child takes over the community. They build a memorial, they name the baby, they hold a town funeral.
Psychologically, that level of communal grief demands a villain.
Yes. The town writes a narrative of a cold-blooded monster. Decades later, when genetic genealogy identifies the mother who turns out to be a 60-year-old grandmother who suffered a tragic, solitary miscarriage in her teens, the town's tunnel vision simply refuses to accept her truth. They want the satisfying, sensational ending to the true crime story they've obsessed over for 30 years.
It is the ultimate danger of prioritizing a narrative over objective truth. When we value the resolution of a mystery more than reliable science, we risk perpetuating profound injustice. The legal scholars in the Harbinger explicitly warn that this entire system of genetic genealogy relies exclusively on public trust.
It's very fragile.
It functions solely because millions of everyday people voluntarily upload their DNA to open-source platforms to find out where their ancestors came from. If the general public realizes their DNA is being weaponized to prosecute their own grandmothers for decades-old pregnancy losses based on debunked science, they might panic. They might log on, delete their data, and pull their genetic profiles. If that happens, the entire system collapses, and cases like Joseph's remain unsolved forever.
Identifying the victim is only the first piece of the puzzle. We have to decouple the concept of identification from the concept of justice. They are not inherently the same thing.
No, they aren't.
If we bring our focus back to Joseph Augustus Zarelli, we are forced to confront a very hard, very cold truth. Providing his name did not solve his homicide.
It didn't. We know exactly who he is. We know his biological parents were Gus and Betsy, and we know they likely had nothing to do with his demise. But we still do not know who raised that little boy for the 4 years he was alive on this earth. We don't know who bought him that blue corduroy cap at the South Philadelphia cap shop.
So many missing pieces.
We don't know who gave him a crude haircut. We don't know who inflicted those bruises. And we do not know who ultimately placed him inside a JCPenney bassinet box and left him in the freezing rain in February 1957. The homicide is still an active, completely open investigation.
And that lingering void points to a tragedy far deeper than the physical violence he suffered at the very end. The true horror of Joseph's story is the systemic failure that defined his entire existence.
To me, this is the ultimate takeaway of our entire exploration today. The tragedy of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is that society's safety nets failed him so utterly, so completely, that his absence wasn't noticed by a single living soul. He lived in a bustling, major American city, yet no school teacher ever reported him missing from class. No neighborhood pediatrician followed up on his surgical cut-down incisions.
Not one call.
No neighbor heard a disturbance and called the police. He was an invisible child, functionally erased from the world, long before his body was ever hidden in that thicket.
It forces a deeply uncomfortable reflection for all of us. How many other invisible children were out there in 1957? How many are out there right now, living in isolation, entirely disconnected from the systems meant to protect them?
It's a terrifying thought.
Genetic genealogy is a miraculous tool for the dead. It can reach back through the decades and restore a stolen name, but it cannot retroactively provide the care, the attention, and the protection that a child was denied while they were breathing.
As we conclude this examination, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider. If you travel to Ivy Hill Cemetery today, you'll see a brand new headstone. The stone that once read, "America's Unknown Child," is gone. In its place is a memorial bearing the name Joseph Augustus Zarelli, carved deeply into the granite, surrounded by a mountain of stuffed animals, toys, and flowers left by strangers from all over the world. But looking at that stone, we have to ask ourselves, does restoring a victim's name after 65 years provide true, meaningful closure? Or does it simply hold up a mirror to a society that allowed a little boy to remain entirely anonymous, suffering in plain sight while he was still alive?
It is a haunting reflection on what our society truly values and exactly who we choose to see.
Next time, we return to one of America's oldest missing person mysteries as we revisit Paula Jean Wellman, the college student whose walk into the Vermont woods helped inspire the creation of modern state police investigations.